The other thing that came out of this was that China was a major creditor of the United States. It was important, obviously, for Paulson to keep Chinese updated. But what came out of that, and this was in the interview with Peston, but it was never reported, but Peston himself reported it separately. So, this is not looking good. And I mean, it makes me think that, these rising bond yields, getting back to your point, Daryl, has actually got these unexpected consequences, which we're not really fully thinking through. And it tells me that once this house of cards starts falling apart, I think the falling apart will speed up and it'll be a very, very rapid event. So the time, we don't have the time to be able to sort of sit down and say, well, we can see this, we can see that, and so on. And so we can plan for the future. We're running out of the sort of time where that's the case. And to get to your point about the crisis, repeating, sort of with regularity every decade or so. The point about a crisis is that you wake up one morning and say, oh my God, what's happened? Overnight something has happened. And, and it doesn't have to be a war with the Russians in Ukraine or something like that. I mean, it can be a financial thing. It can be rather like the Credit Anstalt failure in 1932. Suddenly a relatively unknown bank falls over and then the whole banking system collapses. So I don't know what will trigger it. But what I do know is that the more I look into this, the greater I see the dangers being.
Is there any way of avoiding a total collapse? No.
Yeah, I don't see it, Daryl. I mean, what's happened in the past is, it was the phrase which was so common at the time of the Lehman crisis, kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
And, there comes a point where, your toe caps are worn out or whatever. However you like to mangle that metaphor. I just can't see how they can escape from this one. I mean, I do remember in the Lehman crisis, there were a few moments where you sort of sat there and thought, oh my God, you really saw the downside in the whole situation, the possible collapse of the whole system. And it was very, very close. I mean, I'll tell you an anecdote. We've got journalists in this country who used to write for the Financial Times, a guy called Robert Peston. And at that time, he interviewed John Paulson, who was the Treasury, I can't remember what his position was, Treasury Secretary or something. I mean, it was something like that. And Paulson, when he saw this thing falling apart, he actually went down on bended knee to try and get, government to agree to the Fed taking extraordinary measures and bailing out the whole system. The other thing that came out of this was that because China was a major creditor of the United States, it was important, obviously, for Paulson to keep Chinese updated. But what came out of that, and this was in the interview with Peston, but it was never reported, but Peston himself reported it separately, was that, the Russians were all for pulling the plug, whereas the Chinese thought, no, we'll cooperate. Interesting parallel. I mean, it just shows how close we were to a complete disaster. The situation is far worse this time. And as I say, the situation with the central banks, I think, is a completely new dimension and very, very concerning. I mean, the one thing that the Bank of Japan has said is they have gone on record of saying that if the yield on the 10-year JGBs approaches 2.5%, then they will intervene very heavily. They will buy in other words, they'll underwrite the yield at 2.5% and not allow it to go any higher. Now, what that tells me is that, yes, it confirms my analysis of their position, one. And secondly, it tells me that being driven into a situation where they have to contain the rise in interest rates, interesting lesson for everybody else, incidentally, in the central banking world, they are in effect committing to undermining their currency in order to stop interest rates rising. Now, that's a frightening statement if you think about it. So, the crisis has really got, in that sense, two halves to it. At some stage, you've probably got bankruptcies, whatever, but you've also got the response of central banks, which will be basically to sacrifice their currencies. That is what the Bank of Japan is telling us.
You know, the scary thing about all of this is that most people are oblivious to what's really going on. Reminds me very much of the Roaring '20s leading up to 1929. I can see now
similarities.
Yeah, similarities, and why as many people get as hurt as they do. They just don't see it coming. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're overspending, overcommitting, and then the wheels just fall off, don't they?
Mm.
They know their house, the value of their house and the value of their portfolios are, sort of up there somewhere. So, they feel quite comfortable spending.
Yes.
But to your point about the end of the Roaring '20s, there is another comparison, and that is with the South Sea bubble. At that time, I can't remember the exact name of it, but there was a company floated seeking subscribers whose prospectus basically described it as a company to engage in activities which nobody is to know what they are, something like that. But that is basically these, today's SPACs, special purpose acquisition, corporations, whatever they call them. It's exactly the same. I want to just raise some money. I'll issue this SPAC and get all the money in, and then I can play with it. That basically is exactly the same. And you get that at the top of a bubble. And I was sort of reading an article in somewhere that these SPACs, are now being pulled because nobody's buying them. So it's interesting. I mean, we could well be already over the top and looking at the other side of the bubble, which is, of course, something that goes pop. And again, I mean, this is why interest rates are so vital. And to remind your viewers, I mean, the purpose of interest rates is not to price money. The purpose of interest rates is to reflect the market expectation of the purchasing power of the currency in the foreseeable future. So 1 year money, basically, to your point, Daryl, should actually compensate you for the loss of purchasing power, which so far we know to be 7.5%. Now, if we believe what central bankers are telling us, that this is just a temporary thing, transient or whatever, it might be a transient for a little longer than we originally thought, then you don't worry about it too much, maybe. But if you suddenly suspect that this is going to stick around a bit, if you don't buy the Keynesian Kool-Aid, then you're not going to want to hold dollars. That's